This is a Black Nouveau web exclusive. We're continuing our conversation with historian and author Dr. Robert Smith. Thanks. So there's been a lot of talk about critical race theory.
Yeah, absolutely.
What's your definition? So we're all on the same page. What's your definition of critical race theory?
You know, that's a really good question, because critical race theory is really a body of thought. It doesn't align neatly with a definition. What it does is it encourages us to think about race in very complicated forms, and to also recognize that race is very central to the social, political, and economic makeup of our country. It also teaches us and encourages us to think about the way law and policy shapes those racial formations, right? It's an important window into what a society thinks behaviors ought to be, how people should treat one another, if you look into the way the laws and the policies of a society works. Critical race theory also encourages us to center voices and experiences that have been marginalized and pushed to the peripheries, and in particular, put those voices in conversation with scholarship, history, literature, and other important discussions. You know, we want to hear from voices of folks who are closest to the issue. And one of its rich and very important contributions is this fundamental notion of intersectionality, that we are all made up of multiple identities, we are all made up of experiences that might pull us in various ways and in various understandings and engagements with the world. And so critical race theory is complicated. In response to these attacks, I would ask, well, do we want an uncritical examination of race? Is that what we're calling for? You know?
It's interesting that you bring this up, because the way you explained it makes perfect sense.
Sure.
Well, why are so many people against it?
Because last year, in our protest moment, the powers that be, whomever they might consider themselves, witnessed one of the most highly educated communities of protesters, activists, academics coming together, not making critical race theory central, but being informed by a body of thought over the last several decades that has raised our IQ about what racial injustice looks like. And that, I think, is one of the core reasons we've seen these attacks on critical race theory. We can make the argument also that there are some concerns about the classroom. I think really this is about what occurred last summer, because I don't think anyone would ever suggest to a teacher to do a poor job and uncritically address any topic in the classroom. And if you look at any of these bills, and even the one that's been circulating here in Wisconsin, they make no sense. And one of the things that I want to make sure to say, especially on a web exclusive, let's just make sure that as we are engaging these conversations with folks who don't know what they're talking about, and folks who are really talking really crazy about this stuff, that we don't and then turn around and sound crazy as well. And it's really important that we understand what critical race theory has provided, multiple disciplines in our understanding of race. But it's also important for us to recognize that this approach to understanding and thinking about race has done a lot to raise the IQ of our society as a whole.
Now, raising IQ, let's talk about students. How can critical race theory, the teaching of it, help students?
Well, one of the key components is that, under the broader umbrella of critical race theory, students' interpretations of the history matter. You know, the young people have played a significant role in changing society, and we need to always remind them of that. We don't move forward in the society until young people really push us and demand that some changes indeed occur. But also, the critical race theory gives us an understanding of how to think about slavery, of how to understand the history of Jim Crow, our current moment that we're in, and also connect those eras and those moments in U.S. history through continuities, using law and policy in particular as a means of thinking about it.
Now, last month we had the school superintendent on, and the question of critical race theory is something that he would do in MPS, and he said, well, we teach Black Lives Matter. What's the difference between teaching Black Lives Matter and critical race theory?
Well, I think it's important for us to say that there are examples where people might teach critical race theory, but what critical race theory does is it provides you the tools to understand our racial formations and our racial inequities better, and more precisely and more accurately. It actually provides the window for us to get smarter about race and racism. So that's really critical. Black Lives Matter is about a particular moment in U.S. history and the emergence of this call and the historical antecedents that helped to shape it. Critical race theory is really a set of ideas that allow for us to think about race and racism more, and sexism as well, more critically.
So to me, this falls right along racial lines. It seems like African Americans wouldn't have a problem with this teaching and being taught in schools, but it seems like white people have an issue with it.
Yeah.
Is it? Am I looking at it too simplistic?
I think not necessarily. I think that most of the folks who would be in opposition to critical race theory, if you defined it for them or explained it to them, they would probably agree with you. But they hear critical race theory, and it's become one of these dog whistle words and terms. Like the commentary that we've seen about folks in opposition to critical race theory makes it clear they have no idea what they're talking about.
Right.
And we have to always remember that. Those folks who are the critics, excuse me, are really uninformed.
So what if we called it something else? What if we just called it history? Would that make a difference?
You know, anytime we start to expose injustices, and anytime we can point to particular and specific instances, policies, examples that expose that injustice, you're going to see a very fascist-like regime of some kind rear its head to squash that what might be considered dissent. And so we could have called it something else, but anytime you are able to find an idea, because we know ideas are dangerous, right? One of the key components to fascist-like behavior is to crush ideas, to burn books. Anytime we see something that is really effective at critiquing the institution, it's oftentimes met with that kind of hostility.
So I know we're running out of time, but I got this question. So I came up with this theory, like you can't plead ignorance of the law and break the law and then be found not guilty, right? So to me, if you taught critical race theory to people, then they have no excuse not to say they didn't know something was racist.
Right.
Isn't that like the essence of what this is all about?
The very notion that there is a community of elected officials, and this is also playing out very significantly at the local school board level, the very idea that there are scores of folks, overwhelmingly who are white, in opposition to a more effective and more critical examination of racism is the very reason we need critical race theory. And the fact that these folks don't see that they are doing the thing that critical race theory told us they would do is remarkable. It's the wildest situation ever.
Is it fair to say that a white teacher can teach a majority black kids critical race theory? Or should that be taught by someone else?
You know, my experience has been a person who's really knowledgeable and really effective will learn how to be a good instructor and a good teacher no matter what their race is. But there are folks who disagree. And there is some consistent arguments that if you don't know that experience, if you haven't lived that experience, you really can't teach it. As an academic though, if you put the work in, if you're in the archives, if you're in the library, if you're doing the work and you really understand and learn that canon or that discipline, there's absolutely no reason why you can't teach it.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here. Thank you.